Our lecture this week will focus on the evolution of hominins. And, normally in a full-term course, this would take at least 2 weeks to cover all the aspects of hominins, including the earliest, kind of the what are the characteristics that mark hominins in the paleoanthropological record. But given the condensed nature of this course and the fact that we took last week to kind of build in some extra time to catch up on assignments, we're going to hit what I call the hominin high points. So we will talk about these key traits that make us human and when and how they're revealed in the fossil record. We will discuss the Australopiths, who are really the dominant hominin group between about 5 million and 2 million years ago, and the role that they play in human evolution. We will talk about early representatives of the genus Homo, where they originated and where they migrated, because Homo erectus migrated out of Africa and well into Asia and Southeast Asia. We'll talk about the tool-making traditions, tracing tools from Lamoquian to Oldowan to Mousterian, and then on to blade technology. We'll talk specifically about Homo erectus and its successors, because it's with Homo erectus that we see what's called our own adaptive strategy emerge, or this lifestyle that is based on hunting and gathering. We will talk about Neanderthals because, generally, in terms of earlier or other forms of hominins from the fossil record, people are more familiar with Neanderthals than they may be with other representatives of the genus Homo. We will talk about when and where modern human anatomy and behavior originated, and we will talk about specifically this kind of evolutionary process that occurred during the ice ages, and how that kind of led to fully modern humans, and specifically their spread around the globe. And so, when we look through the fossil record, particularly at this period between about 6 and 8 million years ago, we've got to be able to demarcate this difference between what we were calling hominids, which, if you recall from our last lecture on non-human primates, hominids represent the fossil and extant African apes, as well as fossil and extant humans, from hominins, which represents our evolutionary line after we broke off from our last common ancestor with these African apes. And so we talked about, of course, these fossil apes like Paralipithecus catalunicus, as we were talking about non-human primates. But what is it? What is it that we're looking for in skeletal anatomy that specifically marks this divergence point? And so, without a doubt, the key characteristic of hominins relative to hominids is the development of bipedalism or bipedality. Bipedality is defined as upright, two-legged locomotion. And we are well aware as primatologists that chimps are capable of moving bipedally. Even gorillas for short distances are capable of moving bipedally. And so it's something that kind of starts to develop, or at least that at least other apes have the capacity for it. But when we look to fossil skeletons, we've got to both distinguish what are the skeletal features that mark bipedality as kind of that full-time locomotor pattern, and then also what are the advantages of bipedality. And so when we're looking at the emergence of a new trait, we've got to have an understanding of kind of how it plays out cost benefit wise. I mean, quadrupedalism was, of course, well established in fossil primates, and we talked about that difference between the quadrupedality of monkeys, where they would walk with their arms and legs of the same length and moving in parallel to one another on tops of tree branches, versus that orthograde upright kind of posture with the opening at the shoulder girdle that apes have. And so again, I mean, just as we examine that change in movement from monkeys into apes, we've got to examine this change of movement from apes into hominins. And so we're going to ignore the first point firstly, this point of energetic efficiency, and we're going to come back to that in just a moment. Many introductory anthropology texts, when they address this question of why did bipedality emerge or evolve, really kind of tie it to this movement of hominins into this open grassland, savanna kind of habitat. And so, climatically, what's going on is the forests are shrinking. We have a drying trend where we've got the spread of the African savanna. And this was something that led to, and we talked about the differences between bonobos and chimpanzees, for example. Because common chimps experience these shrinking forests with direct competition with gorillas. And so, as such, they were constrained to a fruit based diet. They weren't able to go after this herbaceous growth that occurs on the forest floor. And so, they developed things like warfare because of really intense feeding competition. So, at the same time that chimps and bonobos are diverging and that gorillas are help driving this process, we have another kind of proto-chimp, proto-human ancestor that's hanging out maybe on the edges of these forests. And it was the spread of the African savanna that really opened up an entirely new ecological niche for humans or eventual humans, hominins, to exploit. And so a lot of textbooks will address things like these the kind of adaptive function of bipedality in the savanna, which is that we can see over grass. I mean, when we're talking about the African savanna, we're not talking about ankle high grass. We're talking about grass that's easily waist high or even higher. And so, in that kind of context, if you were moving quadrupedally, you're not going to be able to really see over the grass. And so, a lot of savanna predators, lions, hyenas, etc., rely on stealth. They crouch down and they try to creep up on prey items. And so, critically, if we can't see over the grass, we can't see the approach of predators. But also, we note kind of the degree to which chimpanzees will, both bonobos and common chimps, will stand up and walk bipedally. If their arms are full, if they're carrying things like tools or large quantities of food, they will stand up and walk bipedally. So another advantage, of course, is that this frees up our hands to carry things. And one of the things that many people kind of focus on is the role or the degree to which humans carry babies, and kind of that critical role of keeping babies close to the breast. Well, that's vitally important for our own species because we've lost most of our body hair. But when we're talking about these early fossil hominins, they're still, they still have the same kind of coat of hair that early chimpanzees or that even modern chimpanzees have. So that ability to carry our offspring would not have been as important. It would have focused more on carrying food and carrying resources. And then thirdly, standing up in a context like the African savanna. In the savanna, we've got intense solar radiation, right? We've got a lot of UV radiation that reaches us. And so our skin would have been black, our body hair would have been black. And if we were walking quadrupedally, we've got the entire expanse of our back that's absorbing UV radiation. And so by standing up bipedally, we are able to reduce the surface area that's exposed to the sun. And critically, the only part then, while we're walking bipedally, that's exposed to this really intense solar radiation are our heads. And then we maintain a coverage of a certain kind of texture, body hair on our heads, or head hair, I guess, but a certain texture of hair on our heads so that we're able to effectively kind of cool our brains and keep ourselves from overheating. And so these are, again, as I said, the kind of standard explanations of the evolution of bipedality. We have to, we recognize that these are advantages out on the savanna type habitat or out on the grasslands. These are not the impetus for why bipedality evolved. Bipedality predates hominins' movement out into the grasslands. And so we can't look to these kinds of what we call exaptations or advantages that weren't the driving evolutionary reason or the driving selection pressure. as justification for why this trait emerged if they don't also hold true in the forest. And so, because bipedality evolved among forest dwelling species before we ever moved out into the savanna, we've got to have a better understanding of what was going on. And so, there have been some really interesting experiments that have been done with both humans and chimpanzees involving treadmills. And so, with captive chimps and with humans, they've been hooked up to electrodes all over their bodies, to things that measure respiration, so that while they are moving on a treadmill, we can measure what's going on metabolically. And so we measure like VO2 max, the maximum volume of oxygen that we're able to utilize. We measure energetic expenditure, etc. And what we find in this series of locomotor studies is that bipedal locomotion is basically twice as energetically efficient as quadrupedal locomotion. So that means that we are expending only half of the energy that chimpanzees expend to move the same distance. And those energy savings, I mean, saving half of your energy is huge, and there's kind of a wide variety of option sets for how we can then use those energy savings. So when we only use half of what had been our metabolic burden to move, we were able to do things like develop larger home range sizes. As we talk about moving into the African savanna, this becomes critically important. Resources in the savanna are incredibly patchy. That means that they're not ubiquitous. They're not all around you. You can't just move like 5 feet and find something new to eat. You've got to travel greater distances. And so by already having this energetic savings of bipedality, we have that option of covering greater distances. So, that's really a big payoff before we ever move to the savanna. We can also, if we've got energetic savings, we can devote that to different, let's say, metabolic functions. We don't have to devote that simply to locomotion. When we've got energetic savings, we can, if we don't increase our home range size, we can increase our fertility. We can have more babies. And in this kind of competitive context, right, where we've got competition over these key critical resources, and a lot of evolution is kind of mediated through this differential reproductive success, being able to have higher reproductive output means that we've got higher quote unquote fitness. We're able to to have more babies and outcompete any competitors that we may have. Another benefit that's going to come up in the course of hominin evolution, if we don't have to cover greater distances because there are enough resources around, if we've increased our reproductive output, but not dramatically, we've got excess energy that we can devote to growing something else. And so critically, when we're looking at like modern humans, anatomically modern Homo sapiens or Homo sapiens sapiens, the thing that's remarkable about us is our brain size. And so we're going to look at this kind of process of brain increases in brain size, of brain evolution, and how that ties into our evolutionary success. But we're not talking about chump change here. It's our brains are a critical part of our adaptation, and allows us to develop full-fledged human culture. And so having excess energy that we can devote to our brains becomes incredibly critical. So bipedality evolves first in the forest. These early forest-dwelling hominins were able to use those energetic savings for moving out onto the African savanna, for having larger home ranges, for having more offspring, for growing bigger brains, etc. Which then all of those give us an advantage then when we do move out into the African savanna. So one other point about this movement out into the savanna. I mentioned already that resources are incredibly patchy out on the savanna. They're also incredibly different. When we think about and we compare tropical rainforest to African savanna, one of the things we're going to talk about is where do we find the bulk of the biomass? So when we're talking about biomass, we're talking about the most of the living material. So when we look at tropical rainforests, there's this phenomenon that happens when there's high wind in the tropical rainforest where full grown virgin growth can just fall over onto the forest floor if the wind is high enough. Why is this? Well, because the root systems in the tropical rainforest, most of the organic material is only in like the top 5, 6 inches of soil. So roots don't go deep. Roots are very shallow. They're spread out widely, but there's enough kind of of this pace of decomposition enough turnover of organic material that there's no reason to develop a deep, extensive root system. So, the bulk of the biomass in the tropical rainforest is found above ground, with the living tissue of the trees and plants and such, not below ground in the root systems. When we move out onto the African savanna, we have a fundamentally different kind of presentation. So I don't know if any of you have ever dug up a yucca, but if you have, think about that process. Or if you've ever watched a yucca being dug up, think about that process. You're not able to dig up a yucca with a hand trowel. To dig up a yucca, you need heavy machinery. I mean, at the very least, like a backhoe, but for some of these old established yuccas, you need a crane. You need large machinery. You need something that can really provide kind of a lot of leverage. And so, why is this? Well, because those tap roots on a well-established yucca can extend down as far as 30 feet. I've seen plants with a 30-foot taproot. And so to be able to dig down to 30 feet, heavy machinery is certainly going to help that process. So when we characterize savanna-style resources, the bulk of their biomass is not above ground. Above ground is a risky place to have your living material because it gets dry, because you can't predict rainfall. And so you're better off kind of adaptively as a plant concentrating your resources below ground and developing these extensive deep root systems to be able to reach underground sources of water like aquifers, like the prevailing water table, etc. When you can't rely on rainfall, you don't keep your roots close to the surface. So that critically then is going to necessitate a change in, let's say, the cognition available to forage in the African savanna. We started off as vegetarians. We weren't eating meat when we first moved out into the African savanna. And so we needed to be able to access root systems, tubers, etc. And to do so, we needed to be able to dig. So we are going to see this important interplay of brain development, cognition, and stone tools in the sense of being able to dig up these roots and tubers. Right now we're focusing on how maybe the energetic savings factor into these patchily distributed resources. So when we're talking about patchy resources, they can be patchy in both space and time. And so it is this way in which these root systems and plants are distributed in the savanna in space that ties into the advantage of bipedality. Because when things are patchy in space, you may need to have a larger home range size to be able to find enough to eat to support your group size. So being able to travel farther distances, being able to have a larger home range in the African savanna was critically important for accessing these patchily distributed resources. A second trait that emerges with bipedality and then critically with growing brain size. We don't see brain size grow right away. Most of the early hominins have brains that are comparable to chimpanzee size. But once brains do start growing, we see a relationship between brain size and what we call this period of childhood dependency. When we talk about the life histories or kind of the pace of maturation of apes compared to humans. Other species of mammals have what's called a juvenile period. They don't have a period of time known as childhood. So we've got to ask ourselves, what is the functional difference? Okay, we already talked about the fact that apes nurse for a long time, 5 to 6 years, depending on the species. But what happens to their babies once they are weaned? Well, their babies are critically they have to be self-feeding once they wean. What does this mean? It means that they are solely responsible for getting all of the calories that they need to be able to feed themselves. we do something different as modern humans. Our babies are certainly not self-sufficient or self-feeding at that point of weaning. Instead, our babies rely on parental provisioning for a very long period of time. So, I mean, think about if you've had younger siblings, think about your own childhood. You weren't self-feeding at 2 when you were weaned, or 6 months when you were weaned, or whatever the age is at which your parents weaned you. You weren't self-sufficient at 5 when you started kindergarten. You weren't self-sufficient at 11 when you started middle school. You might not even be self-sufficient now. I mean, I know we've got some dual credit students in our class. I think about my own daughter being a dual credit student. She is certainly capable of cooking food, but she doesn't have a job that covers the bills to buy the food. So critically, even at the age of 15, almost 16, she's not self-sufficient. So um, childhood is when we wean youngsters, we wean infants, and then still continue to provision them. We're expecting them to do something else with their time. And critically, this relates right back to the fact that we've got these patchy resources that you've got to be able to map both in space and in time. Critically, what we expect our children to do versus what non-human primates do, we expect them to learn all of the behaviors that go along with what we call extractive foraging. We expect them to learn how to predict where food's going to be. We expect them to learn how to use the tools that are necessary to access that food, how to process that food eventually in time, how to cook that food, so on and so forth. So we have this feeding niche that requires a lot of skill and thusly requires a long period of learning. So these two go hand in hand. It's not, though, I mean, childhood doesn't emerge simply because we require a large period of learning. We've got a relationship with our brain size that also ties into childhood. Our brains as humans are only 30% of adult brain size when we're born, which means that we've got 70% of our brain size to grow after birth, after we're out of the womb. So we have this critical period of time during infancy and young childhood where we're not only learning the behaviors that we're going to have to utilize as adults, but we are also critically growing our brains. But when we contrast this to let's say rhesus macaques and chimpanzees, rhesus macaque brains are 70% of adult size when they're born. So they've got a period of brain growth, but it's only 30%, right? When we look at chimpanzees, their brains are about 50% of adult brain size when they're born. So a longer period of let's say, critical development, but not as long as what humans are doing. So when we have big brains and we thusly need time to grow big brains, we have this longer period of childhood dependency. So it's both the cause and the effect, right? Once we've seen an increase in brain size, we're going to comparably extend that period of dependency on parents and on parental provisioning, which then means that we're going to have a longer period of time during which we can learn the skills necessary or how to use our big brains to access our feeding niche. Which then is going to give us higher productivity as adults. If we learn those skills, we're able to produce more resources, which then means we can grow our brains even bigger. So we have what's called a ratcheting effect of brain size and this period of dependence and other kinds of traits that relate to humans. The third defining feature of hominins is tool use, but this isn't, critically, this is not unique to hominins. We've already talked about how chimpanzees use tools. They do so to access things like hunted game. When we were talking about the bush baby skewering that modern chimpanzee females are doing, they use tools to access termites, to access ants, to access honey, so on and so forth. So there are a number of resources that chimpanzees at least utilize that require tool use. And then we talked, I think, a little bit about the capuchin monkeys that have been seen now using stones to dig up roots and tubers, which is much more closely related to kind of that feeding niche that would have been available to us as early hominins on the African savanna. So the latent ability or cognition to use tools is present in probably our last common ancestor, but we take that as hominins and we ramp it up. As we move out onto the savannah, it becomes a necessity to use tools. So now suddenly it's not just something we're able to do kind of in conjunction with simply collecting fruit, but something that's necessary to produce any calories. And we take that and run with it. We start building what we call tool cultures. And so as hominins develop and evolve, their tool use is going to become even more specialized. And then lastly, we see changes in human teeth. When we think about the texture of the plants that are available in the African savanna relative to those that are available in the tropical rainforest, I mean, ripe fruit doesn't even require teeth to eat. Babies are able to, even before they have their first teeth break through their gums, they're able to eat things like avocados and bananas because those don't require teeth to chew, right? Those are really incredibly soft. They're not a resource that requires a lot of chewing, right? You can just mash them up with your tongue and then swallow them. When we think about the resources that are available in the African savanna, it's like comparing an avocado or a banana to a raw sweet potato. Okay, if you've ever cut a raw sweet potato or a raw winter squash, you recognize that sometimes it's hard to even get through them with a knife. When they're not cooked. Okay, so these are things that have very thick rinds. The kind of meat of the tuber itself is very fibrous and gritty. And so, what does this do? This wears down our teeth. We don't develop fire right away. So, we're not cooking our food. And so, because of this kind of gritty texture of these kinds of savanna type foods, we see a change to our molars very, very quickly. You guys did that beak finch activity. Really, the purpose of that was to demonstrate that feeding apparatus evolve really, really quickly. You've got to be able to to access food in a way that kind of reduces feeding competition if you're going to stay alive. And so for finches, it was the beak that evolved very, very quickly. For humans, it's going to be the molars that evolve very, very quickly. And so we see rapid differentiation of teeth. Basically, we see the molars get really massive. We also see the enamel thicken almost right away. This trend continues until culturally we're able to control fire. So that really continues until about the advent of Homo erectus. But it's not simply enough to have big teeth. You have to be able to use big teeth. And so we see traits that are marked in the skeleton or in the skull, particularly that allow for the use of large molars. And so it takes a lot of muscles to be able to move large jaws and to use your large molars to effectively kind of crush and pulverize and break down that plant material. And so these muscles, I mean, open your mouth a few times, pretend like you're chewing gum. These muscles wrap around your cheeks. And these muscles, I mean, you can feel them move. Let's say you've got your hand like on your temple. You can feel those muscles go kind of around your skull, and they have an anchor point that's at the top of your head. And so in skulls that we see early on in hominin evolution, we see the development of what's called a sagittal crest. This is kind of a ridge like what we see with gorillas, a ridge that develops along the top of the skull that it isn't there for intimidation. It's not to make their skull look bigger. It's there as an anchor point for the muscles that have to move the jaw. We also see a heavy, what we call brow ridge, which again is this anchor point for this massive musculature. So our jaws become massive early on during evolution because of the role that they play in being able to chew our food. Our teeth become massive. We develop kind of this, or we rely on this third set of molars that's going to come in around 18 or 19. We now call these wisdom teeth. Those selective pressures, though, are minimized or kind of even reversed once we start controlling fire. And so those early evolutionary trends are lost later in human evolution. So before we end this first part and then carry on over to the second part of our lecture, there are three places then in the human body, in fossil hominins' bodies, that we're able to kind of mark whether they were hominin or hominid, that we're able to mark bipedality. One of those is the foot, right? Chimpanzees and other great apes have a grasping big toe. Humans no longer have a grasping big toe. Our big toe is in line with the rest of our toes, and then later in our development, we develop an arch to our foot that helps with effective bipedal locomotion. So we can look to foots. We can look to feet to mark bipedality and mark thusly this kind of demarcation between hominids and hominins. We can also look at the pelvis. Our pelvises rotate up and under and have a very different shape than chimpanzee pelvises have, and thusly support more upright bipedal locomotion. So when we look at fossil hominins, their pelvis is somewhere kind of in the middle. And then we can also look to the skull, critically to a feature in your skull called your foramen magnum. This is the hole where the spinal column connects to the rest of the skull. And so in quadrupedal animals, the foramen magnum is at the back of the skull. And this allows, as they're moving quadrupedally, this allows their eyes to be oriented forward. In human skulls, the foramen magnum is at the base of the skull, and what this allows then is for our eyes to be focused forward when we're standing upright on two legs. So this will be one of the big features that we'll talk about in the second part as we talk about some of the earliest hominins.